to all of you that are jumping here to continue the reading of the book by Samuel Roberts titled The Gypsies, Origin, Their Continuation, and Destination. I applaud you for not leaving me stranded in Egypt. Hello, I am Daisy, your hostess. I did tell you this book was a bit antiquarian, and much of it has to do with the year it was written and also the author. Samuel Roberts was the second son of a merchant who at the age of 14 entered his father's business of silver and plated goods until he established a firm of his own with a showroom in Duke, London, and it was very prosperous. Later on, he began to contribute articles to the newspaper named the Sheffield Iris, which were well received. He partnered with James Montgomery of the newspaper firm and initiated many philanthropic projects to include the abolition of the use of climbing boys in sweeping chimneys. Quickly, Roberts became known as the pauper's advocate. Among the many other benevolent causes he championed was the abolition of slavery and opposition to war, to capital punishment, and advocated for less fortunate via the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. It seems to me that Samuel Roberts lived at interesting times and chose not to sit on his laurels, but to use the influence of the pen to make a difference in issues that were dear to his heart, in particular, his concern for the Romani people. In the first video, which if you missed it, you can grab from my book playlist, we learned that Roberts is proposing that Gypsies are descendants of the Egyptians post-Diluvian. We'll talk more about that. But as some of you know, I have brought several creation stories, and whether it be the Hopis of North America, the Epic of Etrahasis, the Book of John, or the Norse's Edda, the Gylfaginning, though written at different times, they have one thing in common. There was a flood. So maybe in a weird way, while this is not a creation story, the author does mention the flood and that incident. So in a way, we've got the flood story here as a theme somewhere in the background. Anyways, back to this story. Roberts, who appears of great Christian faith, holds that there exist prophecies by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezequiel, which he quoted Bible verses reflecting such language of the fall of Egypt, each in their own way. Robert quotes Jeremiah from the Christian Bible, who foretold that of the remnants of Judah, that if they were determined to go and live in Egypt, they would fall in Egypt and be killed by war. Jeremiah was a Hebrew prophet and reformer who was born into a priestly family in Judah. He was born before Jesus Christ, and he began his ministry around 627 BC and continued until the first fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. And his prophecies centered on the need for reform and warnings of impending judgment, idolatry, and social injustice. The author also mentions Herodotus in this book, and Herodotus was a Greek historian who lived from approximately 484 BCE to 425 BCE. He doesn't directly name Jeremiah in his accounts, but he does write of the fall of Babylon, which aligns with the time period in which Jeremiah made his prophecy. I'm not going to talk too much about this first chapter, but I believe that Samuel Roberts was attempting to give us some foundation of ancient Egyptians and their fall from grace. So sit back as we go into the next chapter titled The Gypsies. Quote, I see a column of slow rising smoke over the top lofty wood that skirts the wild. A wandering and houseless tribe there eat their miserable meal. A kettle, slung between two poles, upon a stick transverse, receives the morsel. Hard-faring race, their scanty fuel from the neighboring wood, when kindled with dry leaves, just saved unquenched the spark of life. The sportive wind blows wide their fluttering rags, and shews a tawny skin, the vellum of the pedigree they claim. End quote. During many centuries, a people have been known to exist in almost every country in Europe and in some of those of Asia, of very peculiar appearance, manners, and habits, speaking a language unknown to all of them. It is now more than 400 years since the first notice of them that has come down to us was taken. They then existed in perhaps all the countries in which they are now found, and from their acquaintance at that time with the languages, prejudices, and customs of the several countries in which they resided, it is evident that they must have been resident in them long before that time. Why no particular account of them written before then has reached us may be easily explained. Their habits were always such that there rarely resided more than a few families together. They shunned large towns. They were continually removing from place to place, and dispersed as they were in the open fields. In all countries, their numbers in each did not appear considerable. Before that period, the wild and uncultivated parts of every country in Europe were so great and numerous that an unoffensive, unobtrusive people so dispersed might remain for ages little known or noticed. Before the invention of printing, any written notices taken of them by individuals would be little read and soon neglected or forgotten. If, then, this singular people had resided in all countries, as they do now, for 20 centuries before the time mentioned, it is possible that no previous notice of them might have reached us. The probability is that they had been long so dispersed, little molesting others, and being but little molested themselves. Whence this singular people came, why they came, and how they came, are questions which seem hitherto to have proved very perplexing or very unaccountably disregarded. To endeavor, then, to answer all these curious questions cannot but be an interesting, and it may be a useful investigation. To this day, they seem to have continued from the time we have the first account of them unchanged in any respect, and perhaps with but little variation in their numbers. No European nation is free from them, nor is anyone overstocked with them. With every people among whom they reside, they in many respects assimilate, but with none do they incorporate. By most nations during the last 400 years they have more or less been persecuted. Yet in no instance have they been driven away or extirpated. In no country have they ever made the least attempt to obtain supremacy, landed property, or even rank of any kind, yet in none have they ever been reduced to bondage, seldom to servitude. They can speak the language of every country in which they reside, but in no instance have they been known to substitute it to the exclusion of their own. In countries possessing them all, they have no temples, no palaces, no tombs, nor any buildings whatever. They have no learning, no teachers, no scholars, no books, no letters. They have no religion, no priest, no gods, no idols, no images. Possessing no peculiar customs or privileges to keep them a distinct people, they still remain so from age to age, in all climes, amidst all nations, and all circumstances. This is the more remarkable, as they conform without opposition, seemingly without objection, to the peculiarities, both civil and religious, of all the people in whose countries they reside. In wars, they have never willingly been concerned. They are contented with the scantiest measure of food, and the simplest and plainest aliment suffices to satisfy them. They affect no peculiarity of dress, ornament, or method of wearing their hair or beard, but, in these respects, conform in a great measure to the practices of the countries in which they reside, at least so far as to avoid ridicule or peculiar notice. In fixed trades or professions they never or rarely engage, yet they are not idle, but, whenever opportunity offers, pursue such trades as are capable of being carried on with their itinerant life and habits. These are some of the peculiar circumstances attached to the most extraordinary race, the Gypsies, dispersed through all the kingdoms and scattered throughout all countries. The dispersion and continuance as a distinct people of the Jews through so many ages is considered as clearly miraculous, and would be so considered even setting prophecy apart. But the dispersion and continuance of the Gypsies, a distinct people, through so many ages in all countries, is beyond measure more astonishing. The Jews abound with peculiarities both civil and religious, which preclude their assimilating with any other people. The Gypsies possess no such peculiarities, and yet they continue equally detached from all others. Surely, then, it is clearly evidence that the state of the Gypsies is, at least, equally miraculous with that of the Jews, and we have good ground to warrant us in looking for evidence to establish the supposition. In the first place, then, whence came the Gypsies? Their name as a people and their own oral testimony in all countries establish beyond all reasonable doubt that they are Egyptians. They have never, in any country or any period of time, given any other account of themselves. It is utterly impossible that such a belief and testimony should so universally prevail among the whole of a people so dispersed, with no communication whatever from age to age with each other, and who, on any other supposition, could know nothing of Egypt if it were not true. It is impossible that this could be true of the Gypsies if it were not miraculous. In tracing, then, their origin, it is necessary to search for evidence to support the claim to miraculous interference. An attempt has already been made to give a slight sketch of the ancient Egyptians and their history. Thence it appears that they had often grievously offended the Almighty, but more especially in the end, by their gross idolatry, by their king having declared himself to be God, and by their having induced the Israelites to trust in their strength rather than in that of the Lord of hosts. God, therefore, denounced great and awful judgment against them by no less than 3 of his prophets. Sufficient of those denunciations have been here brought forward to show the support and tendency of them. Those prophecies and denunciations have hitherto been only in part accomplished. The remainder of them relate to a people who have not been heard of, scarcely thought of, during more than 2,000 years, yet they must exist somewhere, or the prophecies cannot be fulfilled. The singularity of their situation, as then declared, is such that, when found, they scarcely can be mistaken for any others. After a lapse of nearly 2,000 years, a people were discovered, or then first brought forward into public notice, which in every circumstance relating to them seemed to resemble the people so lost. And they are so circumstanced that if they are not that people, it seems utterly impossible to account for the peculiarity of their situation and habits, or to say who they are. If the Gypsies are not the dispersed Egyptians, where are that scattered people? If the dispersed and scattered Gypsies are not the descendants of the offending Egyptians, what are they? The ancient language of the Egyptians is a lost language. The language of the Gypsies is one that is spoken by no other people, and yet it is universally the same with them in every nation and in every country throughout the world in which they are scattered. There is one very peculiar circumstance respecting the Gypsies. Though they profess, as a people, no pure religion, yet they worship no idols. They have no images among them. This, at first sight, would seem to militate against their being from Egypt, the very nursery of polytheism. But farther reflection will prove it to be a strong confirmation of their being the dispersed Egyptians. On any other supposition, it is impossible to account for so singular a circumstance. Respecting the offending Egyptians, God declared by the mouth of his prophet, "I will destroy their idols, and I will cause their images to cease." Here, then, is a sufficient cause to produce such an effect, and the only cause apparently capable of producing it, God being expressly declared to have ordained it in this one instance, and in this one instance only. No other people so circumstanced were ever known to have been without objects of worship. God's depriving the Egyptians of these idolatrous objects is, in what appears to be his usual course of dispensing his judgment, viz., depriving the transgressors of those things by which they sinned or by which they were led to transgress. This is not the only instance in which the hand of God is thus made visible in their case, on the supposition that the Gypsies are the ancient Egyptians. For instance, the Egyptians prided themselves most particularly on the magnitude and durability of their structures, whether palaces, temples, or tombs. The Gypsies have not any of these. A slight, movable, perishable covering of cloth serves them to be born, to live, and to die. The Egyptians regarded themselves, and were regarded by others, as the wisest and most learned people on the face of the earth, looking down with contempt on all other. Few of the Gypsies, even in countries where the poorest are learned, Scotland, know a letter, nor was there ever, as far as I know, a single sentence written in their language since their dispersion. The Egyptians were luxurious in their eating, beyond most, if not all, the nations of antiquity. The Gypsies subsist on the plainest food, even the carcasses of dead animals that are thrown out or left to rot. The Egyptians were splendid in their attire, vain of their dress, and of their great riches. The Gypsies are generally clothed in rags, abjectly poor, and despised by the vilest of the meanest people. The dead bodies of the Egyptians were preserved at an expense, and deposited in splendor such as the world never witnessed on such occasions either before or since their time. Footnote: the following is the interesting relation of the death, the embalming, and the burying of Jacob as given in the 50th chapter of Genesis. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed, and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people. And Joseph fell upon his father's face, and wept upon him, and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph, and his brethren, and his father's house. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor at Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a very great and sore lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. End quote. The dead bodies of the Gypsies are disposed of without either expense or ceremonies. The grave of a Gypsy is scarcely known in the world. They shall be desolate amidst the countries that are desolate, said the Lord. And there is no people in the civilized world so desolate that the Gypsies would not appear among them more so. This must be the Lord's doing. It is indeed marvelous in our eyes. If we believe in the miraculous dispersion and future recall to their own country of the Jews, I do not see how we can withhold our assent to the scattering among all countries and subsequent reassembling in the land of their habitation of the Egyptians. Both occurrences are declared by the same prophets, the latter fully as frequently, as strongly, and as plainly as the former. The two events are so intimately connected that it seems scarcely possible to separate them, and they mutually add confirmation, interest, and importance to each other. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, said the prophet Isaiah, speaking of the Jews and the Egyptians, both he that helpeth and he that is helpen shall fall down, and they shall fail together. It is probable that the number of the scattered Egyptians may not be very inferior to that of the dispersed Jews, and it is not impossible that the former may be the pioneers appointed to clear the way for the returning Israelites, the fullness of the Gentiles being first to come in, as they were the instruments of their dispersion. The conversion of the Egyptians may indeed be the instrument appointed for the conversion of the Jews. In conjunction, the two events increase the awful solemnity of the Jewish reassemblage in the land of Judah most exceedingly. The future temporal state of the two people, however, appears to be intended to be very different. The Egyptians are, it is said, to be an abject nation, but as they are finally to be taught to know the Lord, to be healed, and to have a Savior, their dispersion and sufferings will not have been to them in vain. A very erroneous ideas at the present state and manners of the Gypsies are pretty generally entertained. It may not be improper or useless to endeavor in this place, as far as truth will warrant, to lessen the prejudices which exist against them. Though they have almost always been considered and described as rogues and vagabonds, and have generally been treated in all countries as such, the imputation rarely seems to rest upon proof. On the contrary, they who have so described them have mostly admitted that they have taken their character on hearsay, while those who have had opportunities of really knowing them have generally affirmed that they have not found them to be such. Pasquier, in his Recherches de la France, gives an account of their appearing in considerable numbers in that country in the year 1427, copied from an old book written by a doctor of divinity in Paris. The description in many respects seems correct, but the accounts which he says they gave of themselves, if they were gypsies, were evidently meant to deceive those of whom they were afraid. He says they were the poorest and the most miserable-looking people that had ever been seen in France. Yet notwithstanding their poverty and seeming ignorance, they had women among them who, by looking into people's hands, told their fortunes. And what was worse, they picked people's pockets of their money and got it into their own through telling these things by art, magic. He afterward adds, though this was the common report, I never lost a farthing by them, though I was with them several times. Pasquier afterward says of his own knowledge that the gypsies had then been wandering up and down under the eye and with the knowledge of the magistrates for more than 100 years. At length, in 1561, an edict was issued banishing them out of the country. They are said to be very numerous in Lorraine and Alsace, where they found shelter in the forest in spite of edicts and orders of council. Twiss describes them as being in great numbers in Spain, particularly Murcia, Cordova. Their language, he says, which is peculiar to themselves, is everywhere so similar that they are undoubtedly all derived from the same source. They began to appear in Europe in the 15th century and are probably a mixture of Egyptians and Ethiopians. It is supposed that there are upwards of 40,000 of them in Spain. Great numbers of them are innkeepers in villages. They are everywhere fortune tellers. Most of them have a smattering of physic and surgery and are skillful in tricks performed by sleight of hand. In refutation of the charge of their being thieves, he says, I have lodged many times in their houses and never missed the most trifling thing, though I have left my knives, forks, spoons, and linen at their mercy. Swinburne says that they swarm in the province of Granada. All the gypsies that he conversed with assured him that they were sound Catholics, but they were not generally esteemed such. In Calabria he found great numbers. He says of them that they only contract marriages among themselves, that they support life by profits of handicrafts, but more by swapping asses and horses, that they generally work in iron and make trivets, knitting needles, bodkins, and such trifles, that their religion is locked up in their own bosoms, that they seem to have no great veneration for the Virgin Mary, but are supposed to believe in Christ, that if the priests start any objections respecting marrying, christening, etc., they manage the matter in their own way without giving them any farther trouble. In 1560 they were banished, and again in 1569 and 1583, but with little effect. Grillman describes them as being found in all parts of Italy, being most numerous in the dominion of the Church, there being the most superstition and the worst police. A general law throughout Italy forbade them remaining more than 2 nights in a place. This was found to be no great inconvenience to them, though it proved considerably so to the stationary inhabitants. He asserts that the gypsies are exceedingly numerous in Poland and Lithuania, as well as in Courland, that they are found in Denmark and Sweden, and that in Hungary there are upwards of 50,000 of them. Cantomar says that they are dispersed all over Moldavia, where every baron has several families of them. In Wallachia and the Sclavonian mountains they are very numerous, as well as in Bessarabia, Tartary, Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania, and that in Constantinople they greatly abound. They are spread throughout Russia in great abundance. In many parts of Asia they are very numerous. Grillman supposes that, on a moderate computation, the number of gypsies in Europe and Asia may be 700,000 or 800,000. The probability is that this is very greatly under the mark. In an account of Wallachia and Moldavia, lately published by William Wilkinson, Esquire, late British consul to those 2 principalities, it is stated that there are in them alone at this day 150,000 gypsies. When gypsies originally arrived in England is very uncertain. They are first noticed in our laws by several statutes against them in the reign of Henry VIII, in which they are described as an outlandish people, calling themselves Egyptians, who do not profess any craft or trade, but go about in great numbers from place to place, using insidious and underhand means to impose on His Majesty's subjects, making them believe that they understand the art of foretelling men and women their good and evil fortune by looking into their hands, whereby they defraud people of their money. It then proceeds to lay a penalty of 40 pounds on anyone importing any such Egyptian. During the same reign, numbers of them were shipped at the public expense to France. They were calculated then to amount to 10,000 in England. Repeated statutes have since been passed against them, but with little effect. In Scotland, they appear to have been much more numerous. In almost all countries in Europe, severe enactments against them have, at different times, been passed. Such enactments have, however, in no instance been attended with the desired effect. This may easily be accounted for. In the first place, they were not possessed, like the Jews, of property to repay their prosecutors for the trouble and expense of prosecution. They had no natural home to which any country had a right to send them. And in the next place, their habits of life were such as to enable them almost to set at defiance all such efforts to expel them. No part of the country was too desolate for them to exist or even enjoy themselves in, and in those days such desolate parts were to be met with abundantly in every country. Hence it has been that all attempts to expel them have always proved abortive. From the knowledge which they seem all to have possessed of every region in which they have been first noticed, it is evident that they must have been, at that time, long resident there. They were not only acquainted with the languages of each nation, but they appear to have been well apprised of the several failings of the inhabitants. They had the sagacity to discern and the ingenuity to take advantage of their several weaknesses. They had likewise taken up the practice of such trades as were adapted to their own habits, and likely at the same time to afford them a livelihood in their adopted country. These things evidently proved that their residence in the different parts of Europe must have been many ages prior to any account of them which has reached us. There never appears to have been any surmise of their origin being different to what they themselves asserted to have been. Example, Egyptian, but one, and that seems only to have been taken up on the ground of some similarity of language. That one is, that they are of the lowest caste of Hindus from the East. This similarity of language does not militate against their descent from the ancient Egyptians, as it is very probable that both language, viz. The Egyptian and Hindu, may have been sprung from the same root. This supposition, as being the only one at variance with that which I have adopted, it may be well to examine, especially as it has been taken up by most late writers on the subject. On this supposition, a miraculous interference has never been pretended. It must therefore rest on its natural grounds, and on them, I think, it may be shewn to be impossible. The Gypsies have, by the above-mentioned writers, been supposed to have been Sudras, driven to forsake their native country by the cruelties of Timur Beg in the years 1408 and 9. Footnote: the Gypsies must have been in Europe long before that time. End of footnote. The affinity of the two languages is the only ground on which this opinion is supported. The only evidences of this which have been adduced are a list of a few words which sound something alike in both languages. No single according sentence has yet, I believe, ever been produced. Now it is evident from the Gypsy language being still the same with them in all countries that it has not changed, nor is it probable that the Hindustani has been materially altered. If so, the Sudras and the Gypsies could understand each other, but it has never been asserted that they do. It is by no means improbable, however, as before noted, that on the supposition of the Gypsies being from Egypt, the two languages may have sprung from the same root. Against the Gypsies being Sudras, or any caste of Hindus, the following reason may be urged as conclusive. It is well known that the Sudras are, and always were, among the most abject of human race, oppressed and spiritless, held in abhorrence and treated with contempt by all the other castes of their countrymen, their touch and even presence being considered as contaminating. Now, though it is possible that such a people as this might be roused by oppression to resistance, and if successful, to take signal vengeance on their oppressors, it is not possible that they should be the first to fear or to flee a revolutionary conqueror. No change could render their condition more intolerable. Any change might make it better. In all probability, they would be the first and the loudest in landing a successful adventurer, and the last to flee from him, especially to seek refuge they knew not where, and from they knew not what. Suppose, however, for argument's sake, that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these poor wretches had determined to fly from their native country, and men, women, and children, all born slaves, had been suffered to depart, whither would they go? It is not probable that they could know of any country beyond their own, much less could they know the way to Europe. And yet they must all have immediately combined in one systematic plan of operations to emigrate to that distant quarter of the world. But suppose this all done, they must at any rate have to travel through Persia, Arabia, and Egypt, more than 2,000 miles. Suppose that 600,000 or 800,000 half-naked, defenseless wretches could have been suffered to cross these extensive and populous countries. How were they to be subsisted on their way? No country, unprepared for their reception could, if inclined, provision them. But suppose that they had by some means or other reached the shores of the Mediterranean. What possible inducement could they have for crossing it? They could know nothing of countries lying beyond it. If, however, they were resolved on the experiment, where were the ships? Hundreds, solely appointed for the purpose, would have been necessary. If they had by any imaginable means got to Europe, they must all have been agreed to divide, each party having their own station appointed them, and each party must travel to their respective countries, even to the uttermost peninsular point of Europe. And all this without any of them knowing the language of anyone of the very numerous countries through which they had to emigrate. The idea of the possibility of such a case does really appear too absurd to be sincerely entertained. The objections, however, against it are far from being yet all stated. The manners and customs of the two people were, from the first, as dissimilar as light and darkness. The Sudras are the most abject of the human race, cringing before all other men, as creatures of an inferior nature, submitting without resistance or even complaining to the vilest offices and the most tyrannical treatment. The Gypsies, on the contrary, from the first accounts of them which have reached us, even during the time of Timur Beg, have been distinguished by a most unconquerable spirit of independence and an untamable love of liberty. This spirit has never been conquered. This love has never forsaken them. The Sudras were as ignorant as they were abject. The Gypsies have always been distinguished for ingenuity, a knowledge of the world and of human nature, which has enabled them to take advantages of circumstances and to profit by the weaknesses and prejudices of others. The ideas of the Sudras on religious subjects would be the most gross that could be conceived. Those of the Gypsies are the most simple. They have no idols, no religious ceremonies, nor any superstitious notions or observances. This circumstance, miraculous intervention out of the question, must preclude the possibility of the Gypsies being originally Hindus. The multiplicity of the gods of the latter people is perhaps beyond all comparison greater than those of any other. Yet tens of thousands of the most ignorant of these superstition idolaters leave their own country together. They separate into distinct clans, all carrying their household gods with them, and disperse into diverse countries, never seeing each other more. Yet every clan, as by common consent, casting away from them their gods, their superstitious observances, their idolatrous worship, and all of them becoming, at one and the same time, free, not only from their own forms of religious worship, but from all forms whatever. This does seem to be utterly impossible. This freedom from idolatrous worship is indeed of itself a circumstance so totally contrary to all that experience has shown us of human nature under similar circumstances, that nothing less than miraculous interposition is sufficient to account for it. On the supposition then, and that alone, of the Gypsies being the descendants of the dispersed Egyptians, can these difficulties be got over. We know that the Jews coming from the neighboring country to Egypt have continued to this day a distinct, though dispersed people. Supposing then a divine interposition, there are no difficulties attaching to the state of one people more than to that of the others. Of the works of that long-lost people, the ancient Egyptians, the more they become known, the more astonishing and interesting do they appear to be. Most awful and impressive is the lesson which, under any view of them, they afford to this generation. But how exceedingly would the awfulness and impressiveness of that lesson be increased, should it appear that the houseless, friendless, despised and persecuted Gypsies, who have for ages lived and been held among us in contempt, are the descendants of the very people by whom those mighty works, at which we are so astonished, were formed. It would almost seem as if all these discoveries have been permitted to be made, and this attention to be excited at this time, to increase the interest which this people now claim. They have hitherto excited little curiosity, yet they have always asserted that the land which contains these stupendous works was the land of their forefathers. In making this assertion, they could not be actuated by any self-interested or improper motive. They knew nothing but the name of the country which they claimed as their own. If that claim conferred anything upon them, it was only additional contempt. End of chapter. Please do hit that like button. Let me know you were here. Leave me a comment, like, share, subscribe, and let's head over to the next video of the book titled The Gypsies, Their Origin, Continuance, and Destination, as clearly foretold in the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezequiel by Samuel Roberts. The next chapter is going to cover modern Egypt.